Welcome, viewers. We enter the darkest age of the ancient world. Prepare for a terrifying truth. Imagine a stone wall bearing grim displays of captive men. This was a brutal, dark reality. Surrounded by monuments of vanquished foes, Assyria displayed its pure, unmatched cruelty. How did a small kingdom become the most ruthless engine of war in history? The answer is fear. To survive, they mechanized war and weaponized terror. Let us explore the rise of this dark empire. In scorching desert sands, scholars unearthed a massive stone carving that made their blood run truly cold. It was no fictional horror tale, but a highly detailed record of a standard war campaign. We travel to the 9th century before Christ, where the Neo-Assyrian Empire ruled supreme. Look closely at the massive mud brick walls of a newly conquered city, marked by tragic human loss. Fierce soldiers, clad in heavy iron-scale armor, tightly pin screaming prisoners to the dusty ground. With cold precision, they use sharp iron daggers to inflict unspeakable suffering on living men. Agonizing screams echo across the barren plains, a terrifying warning to those resisting. These tragic physical remains are hung across the towering city walls for all the world to see. Nearby, specialized soldiers meticulously stack the remains of vanquished foes for a dark pyramid. This was not blind rage. It was a deeply calculated and strategic psychological campaign. Turning one rebellious city into hell ensured 100 other nations would gladly surrender. Assyrians were true masters of weaponizing absolute horror to control the ancient world. Kings and nobles of defeated lands were often forced to bear the remnants of their closest friends. Captured rebels had their sight and features permanently stolen before returning to their homelands. Some texts even describe captives meeting a devastating fiery doom as a power display. Every brutal detail was carefully recorded and carved into massive stone reliefs by artists. These graphic carvings were placed within the king's grand palace, intimidating visiting diplomats. According to ancient records, King Ashurnasirpal proudly boasted about staining mountains deeply red. He claimed to have washed his weapons in the Great Sea, leaving a trail of devastation behind. The sheer scale of their cruelty still shocks historians, revealing a uniquely dark human chapter. But why did this specific empire choose such extreme violence to maintain their absolute power? Was it a cultural obsession with death, or a desperate survival tactic from a tragic past? To understand the roots of this madness, we must look beyond the tragic walls and examine their past. Before they were feared conquerors, the Assyrians were actually frequent victims of ancient warfare. Let us peel back the layers of time to reveal the fragile beginnings of this monstrous machine. Imagine a small, vulnerable kingdom, situated on a flat, open plain with no defensive walls. They were constantly surrounded by aggressive neighbors who sought to plunder their limited resources. For centuries, the early Assyrian people lived in constant fear of brutal raids and total ruin. Generation after generation endured immense suffering, shaping a profoundly hardened culture. They learned a harsh lesson. In a ruthless world, you must become the ultimate predator to live. Facing total extinction, the Assyrian state initiated a radical, desperate transformation. They completely restructured their entire society, turning every aspect of life to brutal war. Unlike other nations that only fought during the summer, Assyria created a standing force. They industrialized warfare, operating a massive military machine that marched relentlessly. Their greatest technological breakthrough came deep within the suffocating heat of their blazing forges. While their enemies still relied on soft, easily damaged bronze weapons, Assyria found iron. Sweating blacksmiths hammered out thousands of iron swords, thick spears, and interlocking armor plates. Iron was stronger, sharper, and far more lethal, giving their soldiers a massive and deadly edge. This new ironclad infantry became an unstoppable force, tearing through enemy lines with shocking ease. Furthermore, they perfected the use of heavy war chariots, turning them into mobile firing platforms. Teams of muscular horses, protected by thick leather armor, charged across the plains to crush enemies. Behind the charging chariots marched heavily armed infantry, moving in perfect, deeply strict lines. They also invented sophisticated siege engines, including massive wooden towers and iron rams. No city wall was safe anymore. The Assyrian war machine could rapidly dismantle walls. With this incredible military power, the once bullied kingdom began expanding its borders fast. The trauma of their past fueled a relentless desire to conquer and completely crush any threat. They believed that their chief god, Ashur, demanded endless conquest and the subjugation of the world. War became a sacred religious duty, and the king was the divine instrument of Ashur's wrath. But maintaining such a massive, ever-expanding empire required immense and deeply tragic resources. The Assyrian economy was not based on trade, but on the systematic looting of foreign lands. To keep the gold and slaves flowing, they needed a way to pacify vast regions without fighting. Engaging in constant sieges was incredibly expensive, draining both their treasury and soldiers. Therefore, they developed their most devastating weapon yet: the systematic application of pure dread. If one city rebelled, the Assyrian army would descend upon it with unimaginable wrath. The subsequent tragic ruin was not just punishment. It was a carefully choreographed theatrical show. The horrific scenes of suffering and impalement were designed to mentally break the remaining kings. Word of the atrocities spread like wildfire, carried by terrified refugees and traumatized men. The psychological impact was so profound that many cities surrendered the moment dust appeared. Local rulers would rush to open their gates, offering immense wealth just to spare their people from death. The strategy was terrifyingly efficient, allowing a single army to control a vast, diverse land. Assyrian envoys, dressed in clean, fringed robes, traveled the lands carrying stones depicting these very fears. These stone tablets served as brutal diplomatic messages: submit to Ashur, or face endless pain. This era reached its darkest peak under the rule of King Ashurnasirpal in the 9th century. He was a brilliant military tactician, but he is largely remembered today for cruelness. He proudly documented his savage campaigns, leaving behind an extremely dark historical truth. Let us now examine exactly how this ruthless king wielded terror to build the greatest empire. His royal palace was built by the tragic toil of countless slaves captured from deeply devastated states. The sheer scale of his conquests changed the ancient world forever, establishing a new order based on dread. As we enter the era of Ashurnasirpal, the Assyrian war machine operates at its peak. The king stands tall on his royal chariot, his iron armor gleaming ominously under the sun. cold, sharp eyes survey the battlefield as his elite troops breach the massive gates of a rebel town. Thick black smoke billows into the sky, obscuring the sun and casting a dark, terrifying shadow. The devastating ruin begins immediately. There is no mercy, no hesitation, only deep pain. In the tragic aftermath, the cruel king oversees the precise execution of his fearful warfare. He points his royal sword toward the trembling survivors, signaling his brutal soldiers to inflict pain. The physical decay is carefully preserved, extending the victim's endless agony and deepest fear. These gruesome trophies are immediately nailed to the city gates for every single person to see. Meanwhile, local nobles are forced to grind the bones of their own dead ancestors to absolute dust. This ultimate psychological blow completely destroys the cultural identity of the conquered. The king demands heavy tribute, fine silver, pure gold, strong horses, and thousands of captured slaves. With their spirits entirely broken, the surviving people submit to the terrible Assyrian yoke. News of this horrific devastation spreads rapidly across the neighboring ancient kingdoms and lands. Fearing the same brutal, terrifying fate, distant rulers quickly send their highly precious treasures. They desperately hope to appease the ruthless king and avoid the terrible, unspeakable suffering. Ashurnasirpal returns to his great capital, dragging a long, pathetic line of chained captives. These broken prisoners are forced to build his magnificent new palace under the burning, harsh sun. Skilled artisans carve the recent brutal victories into massive stone walls along the grand halls. Foreign diplomats visiting the palace are forced to walk past these terrifying, graphic stone displays. They stare in absolute horror at the detailed depictions of brutal torture and mass tragic ends. The message is crystal clear. Any rebellion against Assyria will end in unimaginable pain. This sophisticated propaganda machine successfully paralyzed the entire region with deep dread. But consider this deeply. If you were a local king facing this terror, would you fight or kneel? Would you sacrifice your own pride to save your people from the horrific, unspeakable suffering? Most chose to kneel, allowing the Assyrian war machine to grow richer and significantly stronger. The empire expanded its borders relentlessly, consuming every independent state in its path. From the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf, the Assyrian shadow covered the ancient world. They established a highly organized provincial system to extract maximum wealth from the weak. Governors ruthlessly collected heavy taxes, punishing any slight delay with extremely harsh force. Whole populations were forcefully deported from their homelands to prevent any organized uprising. This massive forced migration shattered old identities and created a deeply fragmented world. The Assyrian army seemed truly invincible, a perfectly disciplined force of destruction. But the foundation of their power was inherently unstable, built entirely on extreme malice. They built a sprawling empire of subjects who deeply hated them with every single waking breath. The seeds of a massive, tragic rebellion were quietly planted in the dark hearts of the conquered. Generations passed, and the incredible wealth of Assyria slowly corrupted its ruling elite class. Internal civil wars over the royal throne began to weaken the once mighty, unstoppable force. We now shift to the final days of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a time of global chaos. The brutal kings sit on their golden thrones, entirely unaware of the massive storm gathering near. Vassal kings still bow before them, offering heavy gold chests, but their eyes now hide a burning rage. Sensing the empire's sudden weakness, the ancient enemies of Assyria finally begin to strike. The powerful Babylonians from the south form a secret, deadly alliance with the fierce Median kings. Driven by centuries of deep, agonizing trauma, this massive coalition marches toward the gates. The hunter has finally become the hunted. The legendary walls of Nineveh are completely trapped. For months, the grand city endures a horrific, suffocating siege, starved and battered by the rebel force. The towering mud brick gates, once symbols of absolute dread, finally splinter and crash to the dirt. The vengeful coalition army pours into the streets, carrying burning torches and bloodied, sharp spears. They unleash a terrifying wave of absolute destruction, sparing no one in their deeply vengeful path. The majestic royal palaces are completely set ablaze, the flames consuming the graphic stone truths. The Assyrian soldiers, once feared as unstoppable demons, are vanquished without any trace of grace. The oppressed nations exact their tragic revenge, applying the exact same cruelty they once felt. It is a poetic, dark justice. The terrifying engine of war is destroyed by its own hands. The glorious city of Nineveh is reduced to a smoking, desolate pile of ash and dark ruin. The mighty Assyrian Empire is violently wiped off the face of the earth, lost to desert winds. Its survivors scatter into the wilderness, their once proud and terrifying identity fully gone. For centuries, the very location of their grand capital remained a deeply buried historical myth. It was as if the ancient world collectively agreed to completely forget this horrific nightmare. But the earth remembers. The buried stone reliefs silently preserved their terrifying, brutal truth. When modern archaeologists finally unearthed these ruins, the dark truth of Assyria shocked the globe. These ancient carvings force us to confront the darkest, most terrifying capabilities of mankind. They remind us that peace built strictly on extreme terror and brutal violence can never truly last. The Assyrian strategy of psychological warfare was incredibly effective for a short time. But it fundamentally failed to create any genuine loyalty or stable, long-lasting global bonds. By relying exclusively on fear, they ensured that their eventual downfall would be merciless. The very nations they brutally tortured became the highly motivated instruments of their doom. Ancient records state that the Fall of Nineveh was celebrated widely across the entire Middle East. The prophets of neighboring lands sang joyous songs of freedom as the great oppressor finally fell. Yet, the military innovations they introduced forever changed the deeply violent nature of wars. The age of iron, standing armies, and calculated terror became a dark standard for all time. Their brutal legacy lives on in history, serving as a dark and deeply terrifying warning sign. The chilling image of the tragic physical remains on the walls remains a powerful symbol of fear. It is a stark reminder of what happens when absolute power is totally stripped of all grace. The Assyrian war machine was finally broken, but the deep scars it left on the world will never heal. Assyria proves that power built on sheer terror will always breed its own violent, devastating end. Were their brutal tactics necessary for survival, or just pure madness? Tell us in the comments below. If you enjoyed exploring this dark historical journey, please like the video and subscribe for much more.